So we're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, one more just jumped on, of course, just as I started. So my name is Barbara Heitkamp. I am a water resources educator for the Lower St. Croix Watershed Partnership. And the Watershed Partnership is a collaboration between 15 local government units throughout the Lower St. Croix Basin here in East Central Minnesota. So we include government agencies from Chisago County, Washington County, the watershed districts across Washington County, and there's portions of Anoka, Pine, and Isanti counties as well. We have a lot of lakes, beautiful lakes in our region, and a lot of the work that I've been doing is working with shoreline owners. And this issue of protecting one shore is one that comes up quite a lot. So I am excited tonight to be joined by some pretty amazing people. So we have Alyssa Thompson from the Washington Conservation District, Mike Isensee and Tom Langer from the Cornelia Marine St. Croix Watershed District. And they're just going to be able to share some cool stories and science and methodologies with y'all. But I'm going to help set the scene. So Alyssa, if you would go ahead and advance the slide, please. This is kind of what we've got going on. I'm going to lead us in with the why we care and what's going on with our lakes and rivers. And then we are going to get a bit into the different ways that one can quote unquote protect their shore. People a lot of times have a very firm perception in their head of what protecting one shoreline means. And so being able to look through those different shore protection strategies and managements, pros and cons. We'll talk a little bit about shoreline rules and regulations. So looking at not just the state level when it comes to rules and regulations, but what you could potentially expect from either your watershed district, if you live in one of those boundaries, or from your local municipalities. Alyssa is going to lead us through talking about native plant buffers and that particular strategy. And then I'll finish it up by kind of talking a little bit about some of the resources and funding that are available for landowners, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. If you do have a question ongoing as part of the presentation, I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and so feel free to type in your question there. And if we come at a good point, or if it's a point of clarification that needs to be dealt with in the moment, we will do so. But we do hope to have some time at the end for more dedicated questions. So I will let each of my co-presenters introduce themselves, hint, hint, when we get to their portions. So let's go ahead and get started. So in general, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, and Minnesotans are people that love their lakes. They love to be able to recreate on them, whether that is boating, fishing, swimming, enjoying wildlife. And generally speaking, we pride ourselves in the fact that we have all of this wonderful water that we're able to recreate on. The problem is, dun, 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 change slide, please, Alyssa. We generally love them too much. We like being around them too much. And the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has a waters impaired list. And so every few years, we're doing pretty extensive water monitoring on a lot of our lakes, rivers, and streams. And we have found that generally speaking, when we're looking at different water quality parameters, we're seeing a lot of downward trends for a lot of our water bodies. And that is something that is to be concerned of. This is an aerial of Macousik Lake here in Stillwater. You can see that it's got that lovely kind of green scum from algae. But one of the things to note here is that while we have a lot of kind of natural shoreline, you can also see that development is knocking at the door of it. And so just our need and want to be around our rivers is changing the land use around them. Go ahead. So I love being able to show this graphic because a lot of times we think, well, we're just putting up a house or we're just putting up some structure that's close to the water body without necessarily thinking about what that does to the amount of rainfall that's coming onto the water. If you look up in the upper left here, generally speaking, when you have natural cover, most of the rainfall is going to hit the ground, half of it is going to infiltrate, 40% of it is going to actually go back into the atmosphere in the form after evapotranspiring from plants. And then you have only a fraction of it that's actually running kind of along the surface and making its way to our lakes and rivers. As we increase the amount of development and lessen the roughness, and so putting lawns to shorelines or building up kind of lawn where water is able to better kind of navigate and make it through, we're infiltrating less water into the ground. As we remove vegetation, we're removing evapotranspiration potential as well, and we're continuing to increase that amount of runoff. And increasing that amount of runoff can have some pretty extensive impacts on our lakes. Go for it, Alyssa. And so one thing, and obviously the thing we're going to be talking about most tonight, is this concept of dealing with shoreline erosion. And that erosion can just look like slumping down into the water. It can look like where things are undercut or you have lots of roots exposed. But erosion is really only one component of it as well. Go ahead, Alyssa. One thing that sediment does as it gets loose is it goes into the water column of our river or our lake, and it makes the water incredibly cloudy. Obviously, people aren't generally too fond of cloudy water, but when you have that erosion, obviously you're going to have some sort of plume where that suspended sediment is going to be making that water much cloudier. Go for it. Beyond that, generally that sediment has nutrients associated with it, or if you're washing in a lot of grass clippings or leaves, those act as a source of nutrients in the lake. And actually only 1 pound of phosphorus can blossom and inspire up to 500 pounds of that green algal growth. That is really not nice to look at and is really detrimental to the lake ecosystem. Go for it. Generally speaking, one metric that we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but we're seeing a very large declining trend for a lot of our rivers and lakes across the state, is for fish bioassessments, habitat. So you have people who love being able to go fish, but those fish depend on much smaller critters at the base of the food web to help sustain their populations. A lot of times, even when we have these big, beautiful shorelines, we're essentially decimating the natural habitat for a lot of those critters that the fish actually feed on. So while this looks like an absolutely beautiful shoreline to recreate on, it's not actually doing much to help sustain the lake ecosystem. Go for it, Alyssa. So when we talk about shoreline protection, obviously shoreline owners want to be able to keep as much land as they have, but they also want it to look nice and work functionally, recreationally for them. But in looking at shoreline protection strategies, you've got this entire gradient. You have kind of down in the lower left, you have kind of your native natural buffers, correct? And so you have vegetation that's extending back from the edge. And that vegetation is being able to kind of hold the shoreline in place. Generally, it is more deep rooted. And then you have folks that think that rock is the way to go. And the only way that they're going to be able to stop that erosion is going to be by putting in kind of large scale blankets of riprap. And then on the right there, you actually see kind of like the mix between the two, correct? And so you are able to employ some rock strategically, but then you also are able to build that buffer in place. So this is where I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike. I have one more slide to think through, but Mike is going to actually take us through these different shoreline protection strategies, kind of address the pros and cons, and then last slide, Alyssa. Woo! Being able to actually think through protecting your shore, but can we protect our shore in such a way that we are continuing to do something that actually helps some of the water quality challenges that we find ourselves in? So I've pitched it, Mike. Now it's up to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Barbara. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Eisensee, and I'm the administrator of the Carnelian Marine Sanctuary Watershed District. And let me just check real quick. Can you see the Protect Your Shore screen?
Not yet. Alyssa, we need you to stop sharing. There we go.
Okay, let me try again here.
We can see it now.
Okay, you got it, or did it just disappear?
It is there. We got
Okay,
it.
great. Sorry about that, everyone. All right, so I'm going to be presenting this evening with Tom Langer. We're with the Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District, and we're going to be covering kind of some basics around shoreline, what we're seeing statewide in the, and then in the Chisago and Washington area, and then just an overview of some rules. We kind of start really what rules are really trying to do when we're talking about shoreland areas really is summed up great by this graphic from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So on the left side, we have development that tends to have large impacts to shorelines, to lake water quality. And so you can see eroding shoreline, no setback, turf to the water, lots of impervious surfaces, and really what that impacts is it impacts the biology of the lake, and that also impacts the water quality of the lake. On the right side really summarizes really what our setback requirements are looking for, our natural shoreline requirements when we talk about things like stormwater management, rain gardens. All of these components reduce the pollutant loads to the lakes and support a healthy, not only water quality, but also a healthy biotic community in the lake. So the key piece here, I think that we really have a challenge with is that lakes really need all these components to have long-term functional ecosystems and high water quality. So in this picture, you can see that we've got shoreline vegetation that includes trees and shrubs and perennial vegetation. We have emergent vegetation zone with those rushes coming up. And then there's quite a bit of woody debris in the water. So both loafing logs and then underwater structural habitat. When we are thinking about this in terms of shoreline management on a recreational lake with a lot of development, really what we're looking for is putting the real functional workhorse plants down on the shoreline. So here you can see arrowhead, soft stem bulrush, and prairie cordgrass. And actually, if you look really closely, on the bottom here, you can actually see the coir log. This was a shoreline restoration, and incorporating some softer bioengineering techniques to basically support that vegetation and build a resilient, stable shoreline over the long term. Then on the top side of the shorelines, we focus on once you get up to the top of the bank, we tend to focus on more showy plants. So this one tends to be a lot of native vegetation. But we'll also work with landowners to design that upper portion with more like a perennial garden bed, because that's really what you see from your property. When you're looking out over the lake, it's really on the top of the shoreline is the vegetation that you're seeing. So really, I mean, the world of shoreline stabilization has three options. We've got natural stabilization, what we call bioengineering, which is a kind of a combination of natural vegetation restoration with some enhancements to build more resiliency into the shoreline, and then riprap or rocking. Ideally, the first two are really what we would like to see on all of our shorelines. But really, there are circumstances, and it has to do with fetch and ice heaves, where we really can have struggles establishing native vegetation and have to go to riprap. We face a couple of challenges with the way the shoreline landowners and the contracting industry look at shorelines. And so there's some misconceptions out there that riprap is an easier product to maintain, and landscapers sell it as a cleaner look for the lake. But really, over the long term, when we get this native vegetation established, our shorelines are more resilient and our lakes have higher water quality. In this particular picture to the left, the challenge that these landowners face is constant loss of sand and then vegetation growing through the riprap. The reason that riprap doesn't have vegetation growing in it is because it's treated with herbicide. So and when this has been applied to a lot of our lakes in mass, which is really problematic. So what we've seen is a progression for shoreline stabilization is first the native vegetation is removed, and then the landowner starts experiencing some shoreline erosion because it's really turf to the shoreline, and then the contractor comes in and promises a nice clean look. And this has really become the aesthetic of our Minnesota shorelines. Our challenge that we have is we're seeing across Minnesota, really through the metro area, is that we're losing our natural shoreline at an alarming rate. And this is affecting both not only the biology, but also the water quality of these lakes. So I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse into some work that the Minnesota DNR and the Pollution Control Agency have been doing, and the results are just coming out this year. We've just got some draft reports, and the final reports will be published in the next couple of months. But basically what the DNR did is they went out across thousands of lakes across Minnesota, and they evaluated the shoreline, and the aquatic zone using a process the DNR called Score the Shore or Score My Shore. And what that process really looks at is it looks at trees and shrubs in the shoreland area and natural ground cover. And then in the shoreline, it's asking the same question, like what percentage trees, shrubs, natural ground cover, is there any woody habitat in the shoreline area? And then in the aquatic zone, they're looking for woody habitat, emergent vegetation, and submergent vegetation, water. So basically vegetation underwater, and then that emergent vegetation that comes up at the lake shores. Here are some pictures of what lakes need in order to support the long-term health and biology of the lake. And these are really the things that they're looking for. Really what we see most often in lake development is we see the loss of things like woody material in lakes. So it tends to be an instinctive reaction for landowners if a tree falls in the lake to cut it up and remove it. So we don't see loafing logs or a lot of downed woody debris. We don't see a lot of overhanging woody structures anymore because landowners like to have trees that are back off the shoreline and in the yard. And so those tend to go away. And we tend to lose a lot of our emergent vegetation relatively quickly. So the numbers for Chisago and Washington County do not look good based on the lakes that the DNR surveyed. So in the graphic, this is actually from the DNR's report. And what they found is that on the 29 lakes that they surveyed, none of them had high shoreline, had high lakeshore quality. They had 3 that had moderate. They had 20 that were low and 6 that were very low. So this has caused a lot of alarm at the DNR, and that coupled with the rate of loss at about 2% of shoreline every year, the state is really struggling with how to change what we've been doing to do a better job. Locally, one of those lakes that was evaluated in northern Washington County was Big Carnelian Lake. And so Tom and I put together basically a Score the Shore process, very, very similar to what the DNR completed, except we did a lot by lot survey of all 196 parcels on Big Carnelian Lake, and the DNR just did sample points. And our results really matched theirs. So in that top portion, you can see that high density residential. So those are lakeshore lots that have less than 100 feet of footage of shoreline on the lot, had scored very low. And then low density, which is 100 feet or greater, scored very low as well. Then the more concerning piece for us from this 2022 survey that we did is that only 25% of those 196 lots had 50% native vegetation left on them. And so our district goal is that 75% of the lots have 50% vegetation. And what we like to say is what we're looking for is we're looking for shoreline owners to basically leave a little for the lake or leave the edges for the lake. So if you have a 100-foot shoreline, try to envision using that 50 feet intensively and then leaving native vegetation, trees, shrubs, native vegetation on the edges. Now, what's even more concerning is that on Big Carnelian Lake, we do have we've been monitoring that lake 14 times a year for many decades. And the 10-year trend, we actually see the lake strongly worsening, which based on the results that we've seen with the shoreline and from the DNR assessment isn't that surprising. but it obviously is not the direction we want to go. And it's one of the few lakes in our district of 31 lakes that's showing this trend, but it also currently has the lowest score of the shore results. So there definitely is a link here, and we're working. The good news is that we're working with landowners on the lake starting this year really intensively. We send out a welcome packet to all new shoreline owners who purchase property on the lake that identifies our programs, and we're working a lot with landowners on shoreline design and native restoration areas. But if you can see on the graphic on the right, the areas that aren't green are the areas where we don't have natural vegetation, and we have out of the 196 parcels, we basically need to figure out a way to get 100 landowners of those parcels to bring back that 50% native vegetation to their lots in order to reverse this trends. So that's really kind of a little bit of background for Tom and I in the trenches. And I'm actually going to pass this one off. Tom's going to give you a quick overview of the science of shorelines and why this is so important.
Yeah, I'll quick introduce myself. Yeah, Tom Langer, as Mike alluded to. And I think this plays well into my background before joining the district. I've largely served as an aquatic biologist, so I understand the fish and the invertebrates pretty well. So it's great to be connecting it to landowners and shorelines. So depicted in the image here, this is what lakes look like without development or before humans really started to settle. So in some ways, the concept of what Mike's speaking to is we want to try to bring this back to the shorelines, but do it in a way that allows for development and in a way that people can utilize the land and recreate and enjoy the lake. So the science behind this, a few different components to this, but I'll start kind of on the woody material. The real challenge is how do you find a system that you can study that is undeveloped, and how can you alter it? So this was a study done in Wisconsin, just across the border, and they actually went into a lake and they started removing the shoreline woody materials and structures in a way that mimicked what is very common with shoreline development. So Mike, I think next slide. Yeah, so here's an image. I mean, we're not talking about small little branches and twigs. These are full-size logs, things that truly provide nooks and crannies for all the biotic organisms to utilize. And what they ended up doing is basically putting a curtain in this lake, and then in one part of it, they went around and removed a significant portion of the woody material, and then they looked at both sides of the lake to see what was the response in the biology. And really, in short, wood is good. I mean, here's a great image that just shows you how that interstitial spacing of large trees that fall or wood debris piles, fish will use it, invertebrates will use it all year round, and it's valuable. On top of that, the woody debris, I mean, here's just a handful of organisms, from turtles, frogs, kingfishers, that all utilize woody structure, and these are also very vital organisms to a lake ecosystem. So yeah, pivoting to shoreline science, this graphic here really underlines different shoreline types. So depicted, different shoreline types. What's the dominant? Do we have natural shoreline conditions, a riprap condition, so rock or seawall, or sand and beach? And what these graphics are showing, they're called species occurrence curves. And the idea behind them is if you were to sample a small location in the lake, you should catch a certain amount of species. Well, what if you go to your neighbor's lot, and what if you sample that? So the idea here is, at what point do you run out of finding new organisms, new species? So what I tell people is, when you look at these, the longer and taller the line, the better it is indicating for the biology. So what we can see here is actually beaches on lakes are very detrimental. They silt in, they cover habitat, they fill all those little interstitial spaces that I was speaking about, where on the best end of the spectrum would be the natural shoreline condition, where these provide lots of different unique characteristics and habitats for lots of different both bugs and fish to utilize. Yeah, so here's, just again, just that reminder that these are the types of images we get when those habitats are present in a lake. Yeah, just frogs hanging out, enjoying things. And then this one, the science of food web. So now this you could think of, how is all the biology connected to itself, and how does that link back to the shoreline? So both these graphics depict what we would say food webs. So the higher up the lines go, the bigger the organisms. These could be your walleye, your northern pike, your big predator species, and then the low end are your plants, your bugs that kind of feed on all the really small stuff. And what you can see in this graphic is undeveloped shorelines have by far the most complex food webs. So they're doing a really good job of ensuring that the lake is resilient and robust to change. They provide you great recreational opportunities for fishing, for even just nature watching. Where then as you move down to things like retaining walls or rock or beaches, you can see just that complexity diminishes significantly in a way that, yeah, it's been quantified and measured. So that's the challenge that we're currently facing as we alter shorelines to maybe these more suburban type looks. And yeah, here's a great image. Just a young duck family utilizing that complex shoreline habitat. And we can't even see necessarily what's below the surface, but these little ducklings are relying on those invertebrates, some of the floating plant materials to grow over the course of a year, and then obviously migrate south. So another cool, I love this one. This is probably one of my favorites, the science of shoreline plants. Real critical. I'd love to share with people the premise that all dragonflies start in an aquatic stage. But what's unique about them is they require emergent vegetation. They have to be able to climb out of the water onto something so they can molt. And without emergent vegetation present, you lose that ability. And the reason I say dragonflies is they are phenomenal at eating no-see-ums, mosquitoes, gnats. So they do a really great job. And as this image shows, yeah, they need to molt because their wings are paper thin. So they need that sun, they need that exposure to really warm up and go through that process. So some critical components. And then as Mike alluded to, we also like to incorporate flowering species into our shorelines. Monarch butterfly is a great one that uses different milkweed species that grow in buffers. So yeah, so takeaway, shoreline modifications are removing real critical key habitats, both in terms of vegetation and woody debris that are negatively influencing lake ecosystems.
Great, thanks, Tom. So Tom and I really work on the areas of regulations, and so we're going to kind of move away from the science and move into rules at this point. So the shorelines are not only complex from their biological standpoint, but also from a regulatory standpoint. So in Washington County, the shoreland area, which is the area basically from the top of the slope back, is regulated by the watershed, the county, and the city or township. The shoreline area, basically from the ordinary high water level, or where which is a regulatory jurisdiction of the DNR, up to the top of that bank, is regulated by the watershed, the county, and then at the ordinary high water level, the DNR, and then everything below the ordinary high water level on the lake is regulated by really solely by DNR. It's fairly similar in Chisago. The only difference is the Chisago, because it's not one of the 7 metropolitan counties, it isn't required to have a watershed district or a watershed management organization. And so in Chisago County, it's predominantly the county, the DNR, and then there are some cities or townships that have shoreline requirements. So I'm going to jump into probably the biggest one that that we work on in our area, which is shoreline and stream bank alterations, and we've alluded to a little bit. This is you know, stabilizing through riprap, retaining walls, creating sand beaches and blankets are some things that we typically see. I'll start with the DNR requirements. So the DNR has a riprap fact sheet, and there's a couple of key components here that tend to get glossed over and can cause some issues. So one, that installing riprap is really meant to stop existing erosion or repair erosion that's occurred, and that installation really on any work for DNR is prohibited from covering any of that emergent vegetation that Tom was alluding to. And if emergent vegetation, any vegetation in the lake is to be managed, then that does require a permit from the DNR, from the aquatic plant management permit. And that the other important piece, and it's down in the corner, is that local units of government and other agencies may require a permit for this project. So DNR is a good place to start, but it's never a good place to stop. So it's just the starting point for checking to make sure that your shoreline project is meeting all applicable rules. So some common misconceptions that we see. The first one is that riprap or rocking the shoreline is a great landscaping practice. And again, the DNR more diligently now, and becoming more diligently than it has in the past, is pursuing the removal of riprap in areas where it wasn't demonstrated that the shoreline was eroding. So this is a big challenge that we're seeing in our area, where it's just kind of become common practice that riprap is installed as a first step. And here is a great example of a project, and this is both a great example of two things. One is just because the contractor says they're a shoreline contractor and they do lots of shorelines doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing them and complying with the rules. And so you can see that this shoreline was clearly very stable in the before picture and did not qualify for stabilization with riprap per the DNR guidance. And the other important part is that unfortunately is the landowners, the enforcement of the rules is the landowner's responsibility. So so you really have to do your due diligence to make sure that your contractor is following the rules and that what they're proposing to put in for you is actually allowable. And the downfall that we see in our area is that typically the landowner is faced with two choices in these circumstances. One, because in this circumstance it's required to be restored. A restoration plan is put together, the rock has to be removed, and the native shoreline has to be restored. And usually it's a negotiation process between the landowner and the contractor to figure out how that's going to get paid for. And most often the landowner ends up by paying for a big portion of that, or their other option is to take their contractor to civil court.
Mike, before you move on, there was just a question that I think is real relevant to your last slide is, how are landscaping companies made aware of the science and requirements?
Yeah, so actually we were, Tom and I just had a meeting with the DNR area hydrologist about this very same topic. And so that's a big effort that the DNR is starting on this year, especially in our area within the Lower St. Croix Partnership to do that. But for the contractors, it's the same. The same as landowners. All of the information is out there. The contractors have to read it, understand, and make sure they're complying with the DNR fact sheet and checking with the city and checking with the county and the watershed district if they're in the 7-county metro. This is it's not new and it's not unusual. Watershed districts have had rules for shoreline alterations for well, we're one of the last ones, and we adopted our rules in 2010. So so that's really the short answer, but the longer answer is that we are trying to put a stop to this because we certainly don't like having to make landowners remove rock after it's been put in. The other piece, as I had alluded to before, is that I followed the DNR guidance, and the DNR puts this in here for a reason, and it's because almost anywhere where you're doing shoreline work, for example, even if in Chisago County for riprap, they mostly duplicate the DNR requirements, except that they have a requirement that the riprap not go higher than 3 feet above the ordinary high water level. And then if, for example, in the 7-county metro, the watershed districts tend to have more stringent requirements. In Carnelian Marine Sanctuary Watershed District, with the loss that we're seeing for shoreland habitat, our rules state that actually riprap is prohibited unless it's demonstrated that bioengineering can't be used to stabilize the shoreline. So with that, do you want to talk a little bit about beaches, Tom?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So here's a common image. I guess a beach, but probably better known as a sand blanket. So carving out, like if you were bringing an excavator and do lots of grading and then carve out an area and put sand, that would be technically a beach in regulatory jargon, and that's prohibited everywhere. But what's allowed and is commonly used by a lot of people is a sand blanket, yeah. So similar structure. The DNR also has a fact sheet as a good starting point to understand what a sand blanket is, and it's I guess similar structure as Mike just alluded to, ways to maintain aquatic vegetation on both sides of your beach. You can, once you bring sand in, sand or gravel, you can only do that an additional 1 or 2 times in the same location. So this is a common issue that beachgoers face, is they put in a beach and then a big storm event comes through or a wake boat comes by and it washes all their sand out. And then they're kind of left with this void space. Well, the rules don't really necessarily allow you to bring sand in continuously, because that's a good sign that all that sand is actually just washing into the lake. And then another one that I guess we see commonly is people remove emergent vegetation, place sand over the top, and that's another thing that gets outlined. So further misconceptions: sand blankets can be placed on everybody's property. It is a common thing that we face where people will come to us and say their neighbors across the lake or just down the road have one and they want one. Some properties just honestly aren't conducive for them. On top of that, as we did dial into like watershed requirements, as Mike alluded to, usually there's added complexities or requirements. So some of our rules actually require vegetation enhancement. If you're going to put in a sand blanket, what we don't want to see is a lot of water flooding into that area from the shoreland area. So we actually kind of require additional plantings and measures that are going to help try to keep that sand in place as best as possible.
Great, thanks, Tom. And I would also note that while in Washington County, the requirements are more stringent, we also provide landowners with design plans designed by landscape architects from the conservation district, and in order to help them kind of meet their needs and their goals for their shoreline, while making it easier for them to comply with these additional standards the watershed district has. So the next piece is clearing trees to see the water better. These, they're depending on where you're at. If you're on a lakeshore or if you're on the St. Croix River, these tend to have a number of different requirements. Although in all circumstances, it's typically the county zoning administrator or the city that has the vegetation removal permit requirements. And so for the St. Croix River, I would also add in there on the St. Croix River, it could also be national parks as well. The vegetation removal within the ordinary high water level and bluff setback zone is regulated. And then Also within the shoreline management districts, there's 10 to 20% of the trees and shrubs. If you're going to exceed that amount of removal, you need a permit with the DNR. Then again, probably the key piece is if you contact the county zoning regarding tree removal in the shoreland area, that's your best bet because they'll know all of these requirements and be able to guide you to the right people.
Yeah, so I'll jump back in on this one. Another common item that we see is creating lakeside or shoreline fire rings or patio features. And as Barbara actually alluded to, this is kind of one of those features that really creates that impervious structure. In other words, as it rains and as it rains and water runs off, we're forcing water to run off quicker. So the problem by placing these types of structures right along the shoreline is we're removing areas of critical vegetation, but then we're also creating a conduit for water to run off quickly. So on this front, if you're looking to add any of those types of structures, similar to what Mike said, contact either your county representative or zoning administrator or your watershed district to inquire if there's setback requirements and how to get that type of feature incorporated into your property.
Yeah, and so the next one's stairs, lifts, and docks. So this is another one that depends on which shoreline zone you're in. The St. Croix scenic area is a little bit different than the shoreland areas, but they both have parameters based on widths and landings and what types of stairs, lifts, and docks will be allowable. So maybe I'll just start with docks real quick. Probably the big piece is that the county zoning often will have or city and county will often have zoning regulations regarding docks, and then the other one to check is DNR. So DNR regulates docks based on complexity, and so a common thing that we'll see is like a deck that runs or a dock that runs parallel with the shoreline and or horizontal with the shoreline instead of parallel. And so those become complex docks and require a permit from the DNR. The other piece that we'll see is when the landowners will run the docks along the shoreline during the growing season. So you can pull your docks partially and have them at whatever orientation during the winter, but they can't be installed basically over the top of the shoreline. So those are a couple that we've seen in the past. I will talk just a little bit about stairs and lifts as well. I don't see it on the slide. I know that when we have shoreland requirements, so it's in Washington County, it's Washington County Planning and Zoning, and I'm 90% certain that that's the same as Chisago. And so what they're going to do is they're going to have width of stairs, and then they'll have maximum landing dimensions. And then again, contacting the city and county is a good first step because then they'll put you in contact with also with national parks if it's a section of the scenic easement area that requires national parks input as well. And we always encourage everyone to start with just organizing a meeting out on site because that's the easiest way to kick off a project and really have a discussion of what can and can't be done prior to starting to pay for a design or a contractor to put together some plans to submit a permit.
Yeah, I can jump in. Adding additions to home. In some cases, there's different restrictions for height. So this image here does a good job of dictating that. That could be a county, township, city, or if you're along the St. Croix, that would be a National Park Service potential requirement. Again, the St. Croix things get a little bit more stringent, where in some cases two colors and replacing windows and all that can just require some approval. In terms of I'll say widening or expanding kind of outward, like adding an additional room onto your house, that would require, again, your county zoning administration, as well as the watershed district. And the goal there again is you're adding impervious surfaces to your lot. So we want to try to find ways to treat the stormwater coming off of these features. Well, maybe I kind of jumped ahead on stating some of these. Trying to just scan, see if I missed anything. I guess what I always like to, maybe a general concept is, what I like to tell people is, when you're out on the water, a lot of the rules also are trying to provide coverage. And the concept being is, when you're out on the water and you look towards the shoreline, the goal is not to see structures. That's really prevalent along the St. Croix River, thanks in large part to partners, but the National Park Service for that. So that same concept of, if you're looking to do a project and add certain features, something good to always be considerate of is are you adding any trees and shrubs to help kind of screen or block some of those structures? It's not a guarantee to getting a permit, but it's a good step to be considering as you're pursuing any form of project.
Yeah, and finally, I'll just wrap up with a quick note that there are occasionally requirements for the establishment of lake stream or wetland buffers, especially associated with new development or redevelopment of lakeshore lots. So typically the buffer requirements can require that there's no mowing or structures or tree cutting within the buffer, and they some will require that the vegetation be improved to be that native shoreline vegetation. And then also just a note that can also include legal declarations, signs, or survey pins. Again, this tends to come up as part of the development or redevelopment of lots, but we just thought it was good to touch on the point that there are some of those requirements out there. And I think we ran a little bit over on time, but with that, I wanted to pass it off to Alyssa.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Let me pull up my presentation.
And thanks to those who are putting their questions in the chat. Go ahead and continue doing so.
Okay, can everybody see that?
You're good.
Okay, all right. My name is Alyssa Thompson. I'm a landscape restoration specialist at the Washington Conservation District. Before coming to the district, I worked in the private sector, installing, maintaining, and designing native landscapes, including shorelines. All right. So the shoreline restoration process, it's pretty simple. There's a lot of organizations available to assist homeowners in shoreline restorations, and many companies that you can also hire to do the work. But this is a brief overview of how you would go about the process if you wanted to do it yourself. And these are the general steps recommended to get you there. Evaluating your shoreline, making a plan, preparing the site, choosing the right plant material, planting the site, and then maintaining the planting. So step one, evaluate your existing shoreline. What does it currently look like? Is it a reed canary and weedy mess? Is it turf with a goose problem? Is it eroding at a rapid pace? Is it more riprap and formal gardens that are not contributing to the health of the lake? From there, once you've identified the issues and the pros and cons of what your current shoreline has to offer, you'll want to make a plan and a general landscape concept for your shoreline. You'll want to identify the goals for your new shoreline and what you want your new shoreline to be. Do you want it to provide ample pollinator habitat? Are you looking for more fish habitat, providing erosion control, more colorful shoreline, less mowing, enhancing water quality, assisting with climate change, providing education opportunities, connecting to your neighbors, adding value to your property, reducing maintenance costs, and reducing herbicides and runoffs to the lake. All these things are goals, and they can all be your goals for your shoreline too. Once you identify your goals, you're also going to want to think about how you use the space, how you want access to water, any view sheds from your home or from your yard, any privacy screening you want from the lake or from your neighbors. Then you want to determine the size of your shoreline and how big you want your buffer to be. And then determine the general feel you want your shoreline to have. Do you want it to be like far more natural? Do you want it to be a little bit more manicured and intentional at the top and look like a more formal garden? Right. And once you've decided on a general concept for your shoreline, you'll want to prepare the site. Timeline, patience, budget, and existing vegetation may inform the preparation of the site. The three most common methods used for site prep include solarization with either black or clear plastic. This is a longer timeline plan. It can take several months up to a full growing season if you have really high or aggressive weed pressure. So it takes patience, but it does work well for medium to small scale sites, and it can be really good for really persistent weeds. Sod cutting works best on shallow rooted turf. There's manual sod kickers or like more larger equipment that can remove more sod at once. But it works best just on the shallow rooted turf. If you have really aggressive weeds like reed canary, it's going to be a lot tougher to get the root mat out. You also have to dispose of the material that you cut, but it can be prepped very instantaneously. Another option is herbicide. It would be recommended that you use a non-selective and aquatic safe herbicide. It's a more cost-effective option for larger scale sites. It doesn't take long to kill off vegetation. It's usually after 10 to 14 days, you'll start to see the vegetation die off. And it's usually recommended you do 2 sprays. If you have a lot of noxious weeds or problem invasive species, you might want to seek help before trying to remove them to figure out the best options to remove them or eradicate them from your site so that your shoreline establishes a little bit easier with less competition. So then comes the fun part, choosing your plant material. Things to consider when choosing your plant material are the height of the plant. You can see this picture on the left is a gentleman next to some big blue stem. So that if you're looking for privacy, that might be a great option. If you want to incorporate it but still have sight lines, maybe you put it on the edges, but it can be pretty aggressive on really small scale sites. So just things to consider when you're choosing your plant material. Heights, aggressiveness, if it spreads rhizominously, the color palette that you'd like to go with, finding blooms for all seasons. If you're looking for pollinator habitat, finding the early, mid, and late bloomers. The soil on your site also plays a big part in both the moisture and soil texture. If you have a pure sand shoreline, your plants are going to look a lot different than if you have a clay shoreline. You'll also want to take into consideration the sun levels, if you're full sun, partial sun, or shade. And then if you're providing habitat, maybe some select species for butterflies, bees, and incorporating them into your plan. You'll want to focus on species that can handle the water bouncing levels in the transition zone. So finding those species that can handle the periods of inundation of water and the periods of drought. They're often referred to as transitional species. And of course, native plants are better for many reasons that have been mentioned here already, but the roots are really what hold your shoreline together and keep your soil in place. On the very far left, there's Kentucky bluegrass soil, which is maybe a 3-inch root mass, and then a whole slew of native species with really deep roots that can really hold that soil in place. All right, so once you decide on the plant material, you want to decide on how you want to install it. The most common way to install a shoreline is a combination of both seed and plugs, but you could do 100% seed or 100% plugs. It'll depend on your budget, any problematic weeds that you might have, and the size of your shoreline. So seed tends to be less expensive. It goes a little bit farther than plugging. But there are some species that do not do well by seed, for example, sedges and some of the forbs. Timeline, it takes a little bit longer for seed to establish. There's recommended seeding windows that you probably should abide by. Watering outside of those windows does help, but seeding in the correct dates is better, which is either early spring or late fall. The aesthetics of the shoreline, it'll be a more randomized natural shoreline. Plugs, they tend to be more expensive, but you can plant species that do not do well by seed. It's recommended you plant one plant every square foot. You can plant at any time as long as watering is available during the growing season, that is from, May to October. It's faster establishment. You most likely see blooms in the first and second years, and sometimes weed ID is a little bit easier. And you can be intentional with the placement, and you can plant in drifts for higher impact color. Some other vegetation options. This is a gentleman installing some live bundles and wattles at the toe of a shoreline to prevent erosion. This is similar to the straw wattles we saw earlier, or the coir logs that we saw earlier. So this is made with live plant material. It's mostly willow that'll then revegetate the shoreline and hold the soil in place. You can also use non-live material. For example, if you had a heavy buckthorn shoreline, you could take all that material after it's all dead, hopefully not a lot of berries left on it, wrap it all up, put it on your shoreline. It's a cost-effective way to stabilize some erosion with material you have on site. Live stakes are also an option if you want a more shrub shoreline, or on the edges of your shoreline, cost-effective way to add shrubs. These are willow stakes at a site in Michigan, and then a couple months later, the willow's leafing out again. So that's one way to vegetate your shoreline. Where to get your native plant material. This is just a handful of places around the metro area that provide it. There's other places as well. Prairie Moon specializes in diverse seed and plant material. They're across the whole Midwest region. Not everything they sell is native to Minnesota, but they also ship bare root plant material. Prairie Restorations is nearby. They have a couple locations. They sell seed, plants, trees, and shrubs. Same with M&L. Outback is known for their trees and shrubs, but they also have a couple perennials. And Natural Shore Technologies focuses mostly on a little bit larger plant material, but their niche is shoreline plants and a lot of the emergent species. All right. So this is actually a Natural Shoreline Technologies site. I put it in there because it's a good example of a recently installed shoreline and the different zones that you can have within your shoreline. So after you removed all of your soil, you have beautiful bare soil, you can employ some of these techniques. So they have the coir log at the bottom as a wave break. You could use a brush bundle for this as well. And then the next zone is blanket. It's a little bit lighter colored stuff. This would be for like the steeper areas. And this would be where you would seed, lay down the erosion control blanket, and then plant plugs into it. I would recommend only natural net erosion control blanket. There is plastic netting still out there. It's less common to use, so it's a little bit harder to find. But if you do go the route of erosion control blanket, make sure it's natural net. And that's for wildlife, and so it'll break down and it won't contaminate the water and it won't harm the wildlife that's around, like the turtles, snakes, everything else. The upper level here is mulch and plugs. So they're going for a more formal look at the top edge, still planting 1 foot on center, but being able to strategically plant and make it look like a more formal garden. Let's see. Most plantings do not need soil amendments, as in like compost, black dirt, fertilizer. Some of these soil amendments will actually have negative effects on the water and leach nutrients into the water and cause some unattended effects. Fertilizer will also cause excess weed growth. Your native plants and seed don't need the fertilizer to grow. If you are in a pure sand area and worried about moisture, you can add peat to the soil. So you take the peat and work it in 3 inches into the soil, and that will just help retain soil moisture for your plugs and seed. That would be an example of the peat moss that you would use. For erosion control for the coir log or the erosion control blanket, you can usually find it at Brock White or at Gerton's. There's a couple other places that sell it. Again, just make sure it's the natural netting. Some other things about this shoreline here, they do have fence around it, which is highly recommended, especially if you have a goose or a deer, or any other nuisance animals that might come in and tear up your plants or eat all your beautiful new plants. I will say this particular shoreline doesn't have a lot planted in the emergent zone. So just a reminder, if you are planting in the emergent zone, just make sure all that's protected as well. All right, this planting here is 3 to 5 years old. It's looking very established. This is one that was planted in the grouping, so this would be like the upper mulched area of the last slide we just saw. Lots of mulch, lots of plugs planted in large clusters to make it look like a more formal garden. They also opted for a border along the edge to delineate it from their turf. Lots of forbs up top for like beautiful color visibility. So this is just an example of what your shoreline could look like once established if you opt for a more formal shoreline. And of course, adding the natural elements is better for habitat. So having the overhanging woody structures, the tree branches overhanging the lake, maybe some shrubs jutting out into the water, the turtle loafing logs and woody debris and snags for fish. The more natural elements you can incorporate into your shoreline, the better it is for the habitat in your lake. Okay, establishment and maintenance. It is a process. Patience is key. It won't look like this overnight. It does take a lot of watering and weeding in the first 1 to 3 years. Maintenance needs do go down after that, but it is a low maintenance landscape, not a no maintenance landscape. You'll always want to be out there kind of monitoring for undesirable species and erosion issues, especially if you have weed pressure coming in from neighboring sites or across the lake. This is the front of a new booklet put together by the Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District and its recommendations for maintenance of your shoreline. So even though native plants generally do not need much water once they are established, new plantings do need to be watered quite often. Knowing the soil type will be critical. Sandy soils will need more water than clay soils, and portions of your restoration receiving direct sun may need more water than shady areas. So to get your shoreline established, you'll want to water morning and night for 20 to 30 minutes until your seedlings reach about 12 inches or until your plugs are in for a month and a half, 4 to 6 weeks. After that, they're considered established in the sense of water, not necessarily in the sense of like the grand scheme of your shoreline. Establishment for that timeline is more around that 3-year mark. But after they're in the ground for 4 to 6 weeks or 12 inches, you'll water them once a day until October, and then you can stop watering for the winter. You want to make sure the entire restoration area is being covered. If you do get rain events throughout the day, you can skip a watering. You'll just want to make sure that your plants get more than 1 inch of water per week. And that usually happens watering twice a day. In years 2 and 3 of your planting, you'll just need to water in periods of drought or when the plants look stressed. All right, weeding. Weeding the restoration area in the first year is critical. It allows for a greater chance of native species to get a jump start, and less competition with the native species. Helps establish strong root structures that will allow them to gather more nutrients and moisture needed for the first season's establishment. So every 2 weeks, you'll want to go out there and take a look at your planting, see how things are going, pull out any weedy species that you see. ID can be challenging if you did a mostly seed restoration. The plants will be very small, it's hard to differentiate. So focus on pulling just the weeds that you know are a problem, and pull them prior to them setting seed. Not weeding will cause some issues with the natives being outcompeted. Weeding is easier if you go with a more plug heavy planting. If you do go seed only, you do have the option of just mowing the whole area down, and that'll help outcompete the weeds as well. So you just go out there and you mow the whole thing. Once the vegetation hits the 12 to 24 inch mark, 1 to 2 feet tall, you'd go out there, mow the whole thing down to like 3 to 6 inches. And you do that 2 to 3 times throughout the first season, 1 to 2 times the next season, depending on how things are establishing. If you do install a shoreline and you have questions about what's coming in, weeds, everything else, you can reach out to the Conservation District and request a site visit, and we can come out and help you ID what's happening on your shoreline. All right, years 3 to 10, it gets easier. Like I said, the maintenance goes down. There is still maintenance to be done. It's a lot of hand pulling of the weed species that you see coming up. If you have really persistent weeds that come in, really problematic weeds, the noxious weeds like the reed canary, the Canada thistle, buckthorn, there's some different methods that you can use to help get rid of that. We'll talk about that in just a second. But in general, any of the annual, perennial, or annual, biannual weeds, you can just hand weed them. Just be careful that you're not pulling out any of the other new seedlings when you do that. So you want to be pretty strategic about that. And then as you move forward, you can consider prescribed burns on your shoreline, adding into your plantings, mixing up the vegetation a little bit, and having more fun with it rather than just work. All right. Common problematic weeds that you'll probably see on your shorelines. Reed canary spreads by rhizomes and seed. If your shoreline starts with a bunch of reed canary, you might want to be more strategic about planting mostly sedges and forbs in your new shoreline so that you can use some different techniques to get rid of it, like grass selective herbicides that won't affect the sedges and forbs in there. You'll want to keep an eye on your shoreline while it's establishing and stay on top of any patches before they get too out of control. You'll probably want to do some herbicide treatments with grass selective herbicide, and using a hand wick, hopefully, if your population's small enough. The Canada thistle, it's also persistent. It's an aggressive perennial. I'd recommend a broadleaf selective herbicide for that. You can hand pull, you can try to pull the roots out, but it can be very persistent. If you do see it setting seed or flowering, I would cut off the flower heads, bag them up, get rid of them, and then try to cut them back and spray the regrowth of the vegetation. This picture on the right here is glossy buckthorn. It's another invasive species. There's also common buckthorn, which I think people are probably more familiar with. Glossy buckthorn tends to like wetter areas and does persist on shorelines. Similar to the common buckthorn, the preferred method is to cut and stump treat it or to rip it out with a weed wrench if it's small enough. But those are 3 species that you will probably encounter on your shorelines. And that is all I have.
Yay! Oh, I'm very dark. Why am I so dark? Hello. Thank you so much, Mike, Tom, and Alyssa, for all of your time. I see that the questions are still coming in. Mike has been answering a good chunk of them, but would love to hear more of those questions. One thing I do want to do before we wrap up, Alyssa, if you could share your screen one more time of my presentation with the very last slide. So there are a lot of resources out there for landowners who are interested in being able to employ a lot of the concepts that we've done here. At the end of this workshop tomorrow morning, I will send out an email that has all those links to it. So I believe I have everybody's emails, and so you will get that. And Mike, you mentioned that you would be willing to share that a PDF copy of that booklet. Make sure that you copy me on that, because I would love to distribute it to everybody here. It's such a nice piece of work and a really nice kind of synthesis of the maintenance schedule. It's just nice knowing that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing to make sure I'm taking care of my native plant babies. There's the one, slide number 12. One more.
This one?
That's the one, thank you.
That's the one, okay, great.
So no matter where you live, whether you live in Minnesota or elsewhere, you have soil and water conservation districts at your county, or at least majority of landowners are going to have a county soil and water conservation district. These are amazing organizations. I like always defining them as these are the organizations where the government that's truly there to help. Soil and water conservation districts don't have regulatory authority. They cannot tax you. They are literally there to put resources in the hands of the people who live within their jurisdiction. And most of them offer, or all of them offer, free site visits. And so in the email that I will send you, I'm going to list all of the soil and water websites that are in the Lower St. Croix watershed basin. Many of them, there's an online way that you're able to sign up for a site visit, or you can also call or email in as well. If you're just looking for that extra boost of confidence that you need, or you just want somebody to come out and take a look at something, they're an amazing resource. And a lot of times too, soil and waters, as well as the watershed districts, are going to have cost share grants. And so if you're actually looking for some financial help with some of these projects, or being able to put some money toward a design, again, the soil and waters, the watershed districts are a great resource to go for. I'm going to include all of these additional websites as well within that email. And so there's Lake Finder that's hosted on the DNR, which is a really great way just to better kind of understand how your lake is quote unquote classified. In Minnesota, there are 3 different lake classifications, and depending upon the lake classification, somewhat governs how they can be developed. And so that's just really helpful information to know, because it also kind of ties to the recreational uses. Are you looking for a lake where you're going to be able to go out and do lots of motorboating, or are you looking for one that's relatively quiet and secluded? So generally speaking, using Lake Finder is a great way to compare lakes. Mike talked a little about the Score Your Shore app as well, which is really useful. The Minnesota Impaired Waters Map. And so if you are wanting to kind of see just kind of the lay of the land in terms of what lakes, rivers, and streams are impaired in Minnesota and what they are impaired for, there's a really nice interactive map. It can look really daunting and very red when you first pull up that map. One of my favorite things to do when I pull it up is actually to turn the impaired layers off, and you get to see all of the waters that have been delisted and taken off the impaired list, just so you have a good feeling of, hey, good things are happening. And then the Blue Thumb. So Blue Thumb is a public-private partnership that has a lot of really amazing lakeshore resources, as well as plant guides and such. So again, I'm going to synthesize this information in the email and send it all out to all of you. Great questions coming in. So I'm going to pitch it to our group of experts here. Is there anything that can be done to prevent further erosion of the limestone cliff along the St. Croix River? So it's eroding under the grassy cliff, which includes her yard. Anything kind of on that you can think of?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I wouldn't have any tools in the toolbox to stop the erosion of limestone. I guess depending on where you live, you can certainly check with local experts. So if you were in Washington County, we'd be happy to come out and take a look at it. Like maybe depending on how it's eroding, there's a toe stabilization that can be done, but no, limestone is a tough one. If it's on the outside bend of a river and eroding underneath limestone, that's tough.
Byron, great question. How do I determine the high water line? So that ordinary high water can be a really difficult concept for a lot of folks. One thing that I've learned is that generally speaking, the ordinary high water level, if you're just kind of looking at your shore, it is a technical definition. And if you go on the Lake Finder, they actually sometimes will list the elevation of what the ordinary high water is. But for just, if I'm going out and looking at a lake, I'm trying to kind of determine where you have kind of that break between aquatic versus more terrestrial vegetation. And it's kind of going to be kind of in that zone where you're going to have that high water line. But Mike, Alyssa, Tom, any other things to add on that?
I think you nailed it. The OHW, the ordinary high water mark, is a DNR jurisdictional boundary. So as Mike outlined, any activities below that becomes a DNR item. So on DNR's Lake Finder website, you can get into that. You can type in the specific lake name that you're interested in. You can sort it by county. You navigate to that, and once you click into it, there's a whole bunch of information, everything from water levels to water quality to fishery surveys that have been done. You'll be looking for that water level tab. Click into that, and it'll list the OHW for you. So that's the easiest way that you can quickly find what that level is if you're kind of doing your own research into things.
Alyssa, I noticed that Mike was trying to share his screen. Do you mind if you stop sharing that one? Thanks. We can see yours, Mike. Oh, and you're muted.
Yeah, perfect. This is exactly what I was saying. You can navigate here, Mike. Now that you're unmuted, I'll let you jump in.
Yes. So I just typed in Big Carnelian under Washington County, and it brings me here. And the key piece is to look over on this left menu under the water levels. I think this is the part that everybody misses. And if you go to water levels, if it has an ordinary high regulatory level from the DNR, it will be listed here. And then if there's somebody monitoring lake water levels, it'll have a graph over here, and it will give you an idea of. You can also download this in a spreadsheet and see exactly what date this is. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put if you're on the shoreline, you can put a stake in the ground at the toe of the water level and then wait 2 weeks and then come to this graph. If you were in Washington County, we would put in a new water level reading, and then you can go back and look on that date, and it would tell you what the you'd be really close on what the water level was. Then you could come back here and compare it with the ordinary high water level here. So well, you could do a little citizen science, but the data is out there. If there's not an ordinary high water level on the Lake Finder page, it means DNR hasn't set it. And this is what Tom and I look at, the matrix.
Can you see how wonderfully nerdy we all are? It's glorious. So additional question that I saw come in. Oh, my chatbot disappeared. Do these same concerns apply to, quote, ponds?
Yeah, great question. My initial reaction when people tell me a pond is it a wetland? And that's probably first and foremost. If it's a wetland, wetlands have special regulations. So I would say in that front, your best bet is to, again, reach out to your conservation district or your county zoning administrator just to confirm that it isn't a wetland. It is very common. So wetlands, some wetlands are very ephemeral, meaning they don't hold water very long. And a lot of people think wetland has to be land that is like wet to what we visually see, but it's a more complex science than that. So it's always great to ask and seek if you're curious.
We actually did a wonderful wetlands webinar last year, and I can include that link in the email that I send out if you're interested in learning more about wetlands and how to manage them. But they can be very tricky landscapes for sure. Additional questions, you can type in the chat or unmute yourselves if you'd like to. Giving the last 20 seconds. Somebody's furiously typing. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. We'll end just to plug some additional learning opportunities. We have a Restore Your Shore webinar that's going to be coming up on May 8th. You're going to see some of the same players here, but in the end, there's going to be some slightly different, a slightly different focus. So you're going to see some different information presented there. Also, if you do live within our area of East Central Minnesota, on May 20th, we're actually partnering with a couple lake associations, and we're going to the Uncommon Loon Brewery in Chisago City in Chisago County, and it's the Navigate to a Cleaner Lake Showcase. And it is all about it's an open house format, and people are able to come in and talk to folks like Mike, folks from the Chisago Soil and Water Conservation Districts. There's going to be people there from Minnesota Lakes and Rivers Advocates who have their own version of Score Your Shore. I'm going to be there kind of talking about what leads to pollution and what we can do as landowners. We're making little lake health metric baseball cards. It's going to be a good time, but that's on May 20th from 2 to 4. And if you go to our website, which again, I will email out, you'll be able to register for that. But in any case, we are 5 minutes early, but go out and enjoy these last glimpses of sunlight outside. And I hope all of you have a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.